You'll only ever be paid as much as you really think you're worth, and never a penny more.
The least you'll accept is the most you will ever get. You tend to buy in the way that you sell, and you tend to sell in the way that you buy. And I quickly realized that actually I was doing exactly the same thing, whether I was selling or buying. Yeah, it's rude to talk about money. You're not worth it. You should never talk about it. You should never spend it. You should save. You shouldn't spend. All of these kinds of things that I was told. It doesn't grow on trees. It's the root of all evil. And then I got older, and I came across people who had different scripts. Not everybody sees this in the same way that I do.
Hello, and welcome back to the Inquisitor podcast with me, Marcus Cauchi. Today, my guest is Matthew Dashper-Hughes. Matthew's just written a book called Show Me the Money, and we're going to be talking about the concepts in there because money concept, self-concept, discomfort with talking about money are key. And most professionals hate talking about money. They dance around it, dress it up, apologize for it, even when they've earned every penny. And so both Matthew and I think that's madness. Matthew is head of global talent acquisition at Gunnar Cook, a leading UK entrepreneurial fee share law firm. I think that's fair. Matthew's authorship of Show Me the Money stems from decades of working in operations, in sales leadership, sales training, and realizing this pattern seems to have occurred over and over again. And he makes the point that you'll only ever be paid as much as you really think you're worth, and never a penny more. That isn't a slogan, it's a diagnosis. So today, what we're going to talk about is why smart, decent people still underprice themselves, how fairness and freedom really work in business, and what it takes to have an honest money conversation without losing trust or dignity. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Glad to be here.
So let's start where the book starts with that line, you'll only ever be paid as much as you really think you're worth. What moment in your own career proved that true?
Oh, gosh. I could go all very vulnerable and talk about times when I've actually made all these mistakes that I'm talking about myself. And I think in the early days, I probably did absolutely everything that we've talked about in the book and everything that I've seen with so many of the people I've worked with ever since. So I think probably the first really big time I recognized it was when I was actually negotiating a price with somebody. It actually was a print supplier when I was a marketing director, one of my first ever board positions. And I realized that as I was negotiating with him, I was coming with a load of baggage about the way that I was assuming that he was going to be viewing money. And he had a completely different perspective on things to me. And I just found myself completely outclassed in this negotiation and basically led with my chin throughout the whole thing. Needless to say, he got his price, I didn't get mine. And in hindsight, I look at that and I think, well, he was right and I was wrong. Because fundamentally, he had a very strong sense of his own value and his own worth. Whereas I was just negotiating on price and just simply trying to chip the price because that's what I'd been taught was value. And it was based purely on the transactional rather than on the transformational. So it's something that you see that you tend to show up and you tend to buy in the way that you sell, and you tend to sell in the way that you buy. And I quickly realized that actually I was doing exactly the same thing, whether I was selling or buying. And it was a big problem for me. So everything was always about price rather than about value. And so once I sort of changed the perspective on that, and I'd realized that actually value is not necessarily price. In fact, price is very often a very poor proxy for value. Then it became a very different kind of a conversation. And so, yeah, I just started to actually value myself very differently. That took a long time. There was a big gap between the two, and a lot of work.
Let's go from belief to behavior and how the choices we make around money reveal real relationship with fairness. If we reframe fairness as agency, not equality, how does that land?
That lands pretty well. And I think there's a build on that. Because fairness can have multiple different meanings depending on context. So equality is one of them, as you rightly say. There's equity, which is that you get out something which is proportionate to what you put in. And I think that's probably closest to the mark when it comes to a value conversation. There's also fairness in the sense of distribution based on people's needs. And there's also fairness based on a sense of justice, which means sticking to what we agreed as well. And that last one also plays a part in any value conversation. Agency is another form of intrinsic motivation. And that is about your sense of self-control, a sense of being in the driving seat in your own life. And if you have that sense of agency and you have enough trust with the other person that you can have an open conversation to give them agency as well, so you both have equal stature in the conversation, that is a really quite a powerful basis upon which you can have a genuine, equal kind of value conversation.
In the book, you say help people easily make the decision that they would probably make for themselves whilst ensuring that they're not coerced into anything.
Yeah.
Can you explain the moral duty of professionals to preserve autonomy and maybe describe how fairness collapses when either side loses that agency?
That is a really, really interesting subject because particularly with the kinds of professionals that I'm dealing with, and most of them are lawyers. They have a very, very strong sense of that moral duty, and sometimes it's hard for them to kind of show up in a way that actually achieves that. So if you are having the right kind of conversation with somebody, so that you speak to them in a way that means that you understand exactly what really matters to them. And I don't just mean what matters to them at a superficial level. I mean their hopes and their dreams and what they're going to hope to get out of not just this immediate conversation or this immediate relationship, but also basically what they're building in their whole lives. I mean, without wanting to be too pompous about it, moving towards some form of self-actualization in their lives, because we're all human beings. Understanding that at a visceral level, understanding that properly, really listening to them, and then understanding as well where they are today, so that you can see what extent your offering and your solution could potentially help them to achieve the things they want to achieve. And if you can, and if you're the right person to do it, then asking the questions that help the other person to see that, so that effectively you're nudging them in the right direction. You're building choice architecture using the language that you use and the conversation you use to help them to make the right decision, the decision that they would make, all things being equal, if they just had a series of very good, obvious economic choices to make. And by obvious economic choices, I mean, they could genuinely list out pros and cons, but who really does that? Nobody. There's always an emotional element. There's always an affective element to any of these conversations. So understanding the nuance of how to have those conversations is really quite a powerful thing to do. And it's actually life-changing when you do it, because it changes the way that you feel like you're showing up. It means you're showing up in a much more authentic and genuine way. You're being much more congruent with your own internal values and being just much more true to yourself. And if that sounds like I'm being a bit highfalutin, actually, this is nothing more and nothing less than actually how you feel really satisfied in your own work as well.
Well, what I'm reading from this is fairness really lives in freedom, not sameness.
Yes.
And so the question going through my mind is, where do you see that breakdown most, on the buyer side, the seller side, and how do you teach someone to stay fair when they feel cornered?
Oh, gosh, that's a very, very good question. I mean, the first thing is to help somebody to not feel cornered, to show up in the moment, to be really truly present with the other person, and to be vulnerable enough to actually be real, which is difficult. I mean, that takes real practice. It takes consistent habitual practice. And even after you practice for a long time, you think you're getting good at it, you still have those days when you don't achieve it properly or achieve it as well as you might otherwise. I mean, I've been doing this for, well, maybe not quite as long as you, but I've been doing it for 20 plus years, and I
Thank
still
you very
screw
much.
up regularly. Okay, let's put it another way. You're better at it than I am.
I'm not entirely sure. So, can you give an example of where a professional might find themselves feeling cornered,
Yeah.
and how they can regain control by clarifying terms, reframing options?
Yeah. So let me think of an example from a real life example relatively recently. So speaking to one of my clients, commercial real estate lawyer, based in London, you know, you would think, wouldn't you, somebody with that level of experience, expertise, capability, competency, education, that they would have absolutely no imposter syndrome, or whatever you want to call it, imposter phenomena. And yet, when she went into the negotiation, or even not, even before the negotiation, we were talking about her plans for the conversation, and everything was about her pitch deck. It was all about what she pulled together, and she was almost treating that like a suit of armor. And it was like something she could almost create a barrier between her and the client, and she was expecting the client to buy into, or the prospective client to buy into this suit of armor, rather than actually showing up and actually really having a proper connection with this person. And I asked her how many times she'd done this before, and this was her normal modus operandi. And we looked at her win rate, and it was nowhere near as high as it ought to be, despite the fact that she was extraordinary. Well, she is extraordinary at what she does. So we went through this pitch deck, and after some gentle probing questions from me, I'm pleased to say we actually threw it out the window. That's not strictly true. She took it with her. She had it on her laptop, but actually, based on what we did, she never even opened the laptop. Instead, she just went into a genuine conversation, and it was a conversation which was based on her having a mindset of total discovery, which means wanting to really understand this other person, and also being honest enough, and disarmingly honest enough, to be able to say, actually, I might not be the right person for you. You might not be the right person for me. We might not be a fit for each other, but this is potentially a business relationship. So it's a worthwhile investment of both our time to at least have a coffee together. What's the worst that could happen? We have a blandly undifferentiated coffee, like the one I've got in my hand. Sorry about that. As you can hear, I've got a slight frog in my throat today. So
You're not pleased with your coffee, obviously.
Well, other coffee chains are available. If you are watching this rather than listening to it, this is not the only one. Okay, just saying. So yeah, basically it became a completely different conversation because of the way she showed up and the way that she was prepared to have the conversation. But it meant that she was having to fly in the face of everything that she'd been trained to do. And some of that training was overt training, because when you first start out in a traditional law firm, if you get any training at all on business development, which is the euphemistic term that we use for sales, because nobody likes to think of being in sales because it's terribly sleazy and bushy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's another point about the self-concept. But the whole thing that you're trained in doing is basically exactly that. It's pull together a nice shiny pitch deck, and it's show your wonderful qualifications and your certificate, show a couple of case studies that say that you're capable of doing the job, and here's some logos that we've bagged, all the wonderful logos that we've worked. I think I say in the book, it's a little bit like looking at one of those walls in a Victorian mansion full of stuffed heads, of all the animals they've shot, and it's every bit as appealing.
Yeah.
It's not going to win business, really. I mean, you might get a little bit of a raised eyebrow and, oh gosh, so you've worked with them, have you? That's impressive, possibly, knowing that they probably got maybe this much tiny little sliver of the business that came from that particular large blue chip, because there's so much out there. So it has limited credibility. It has some credibility, but it's limited. And so all of these trappings of sales actually get in the way of a genuine conversation. And ultimately, it is coming back to that people do business with people, but they're people that they trust, and they only trust people that they see have got a moral value that's similar to theirs, and B, actually they know they've got their best interests at heart. If you don't have that benevolence of intent, and if you can't demonstrate it by how you show up, you're never going to get that freedom through autonomy.
You've touched on something that I spend a lot of my time and work on, which is the seller shows up and uses these accoutrements as a shield for themselves, but they actually act as a weapon to try and transact and convince and persuade. And one of the lessons I always teach is that no one wants to be convinced, closed, handled. They don't want to be lied to, manipulated. And so I think what you're describing here is a possible situation where fairness isn't just control in polite clothes. Um, so where is the line between ethical persuasion and emotional manipulation?
I think that's a very interesting question. It's a bit. I almost don't want to say this quote but it's the one that's come to mind. Like the old quote about pornography. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. It's not. It's not. You know the difference between erotica and porn. You know the difference between emotional manipulation and actually helping somebody to make the right decision, and it comes from intent. It's all about benevolence of intent. If you show up with a genuine positive regard for somebody else, in humanistic philosophy. Sorry, this is sounding like I really am going very highfalutin here, but a humanistic philosophy that underpins things like person-centered therapy, person-centered counseling, person-centered coaching, that kind of thing, which is very much underpins the approach that I try to adopt. The three core principles are empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. So empathy is a process by which you truly feel what the other person feels. Congruence is where you are authentically congruent with who you really are yourself. So you know yourself, you have that self-awareness, you have that internal locus of evaluation that says, here are my values, here is the baseline, here's the things I stand for and the things I will not stand for. I know who I am and I know what I'm supposed to be doing here, and I know what I believe. And you are congruent with that under all circumstances. But the third and most important one in many regards is this unconditional positive regard that you have for the other person. You have to want the best for them, even when what is best for them is not necessarily in your best interests. If you're prepared to, quote unquote, lose a sale, and I take issue with the word lose because it was never yours really, or it shouldn't have been. If you're prepared to lose a sale because you know that you're not the right person to provide the solution, then it's not emotional manipulation. All you are doing really is helping the other person.
Well, I think you're also touching on the differentiation between your identity and your role.
Yes.
So can we just spend a minute or two on defining the differences, and especially how that affects congruence and empathy, and then how that then feeds into genuine positive regard for the other person?
I'll take this through the lens of Carl Rogers, who was the father of person-centered counseling, person-centered therapy, because he talks about internal and external loci of evaluation. So this is about how you evaluate who you really are at a core level. And because of the nature of our society, particularly Western society, we tend to cleave more to external loci of evaluation when we're judging who we are. And so we tend to define ourselves in terms of not only those external loci, whatever they are, our role, performance, our the way we think we ought to be showing up for things, but also the stories we tell ourselves about the way that other people see us. So it's all very external. It's all very much about our roles and about those things. And the problem with all of those external loci is that they are conditional. They're conditional on circumstances. They're conditional on how experienced you are in that particular role or whatever it is you do. They're conditional on whether you got enough sleep last night. They're conditional on any number of factors, many of which are completely beyond your control or influence, which means that you cannot, by definition, perform at 100% all the time. So if you anchor your sense of self only to those external loci, you are guaranteeing yourself to feel pretty crappy quite a lot of the time. Whereas if you are also aware of your internal locus of evaluation, something core, something foundational, something fundamental that is true to you, that is immutable, that is not conditional, that is totally intrinsic and doesn't actually change over time, that actually is baked into who you really are at a fundamental level, then you've got an anchor point, and that can be 100% all the time. And don't get me wrong, there can be times when you don't show up quite as well as you'd have liked to based on that, but that's okay, because providing you have the self-awareness about your core values, let's say, and you know what they are, and you know the shortcomings you had, well, that's okay, because then that shows up as guilt and it shows up as regret. And guilt and regret aren't very pleasant, but they are good because they're teachers. They can teach you how you could do it better next time. If you don't have a strong evaluation of your internal locus of evaluation, or a strong understanding of your internal locus of evaluation, then unfortunately any dissonance that comes in between the way you behave and the way that you fundamentally believe you ought to be behaving, because you're not aware of those fundamental beliefs, or you don't really know them, you haven't articulated them, then unfortunately any regret, any dissonance doesn't turn up as regret, it turns up as shame. And it doesn't turn up as the teacher, it turns up as anxiety. And that becomes fundamental to who you are, and it actually makes you, genuinely really miserable in your life. And shame is difficult because it's different to guilt. Shame is, I am a bad person rather than I did a thing badly.
Well, it's interesting as well because you get reflected back what you project out.
Yes.
And if you're looking at it through the jobs to be done lens, if you're projecting out anxiety, you'll be creating anxiety, which will cause people to fear change, and that will result in the middle of your funnel being full of ghosts and constipation. So let's just go one step further, which is, does it ever occur where total transparency around money fails to build trust, and can it sometimes kill it?
Well, yes, because it takes two to tango. And assuming that you're in a one-on-one conversation with somebody, you've not only got your own money mindset and concept to deal with, you've also got theirs. And you can certainly show up in a way that means you're too open and transparent about it, because the other person might be feeling very awkward and very diffident about it. And so you have to sort of be a bit nuanced and a bit clever about how you talk about these things, and you have to listen very carefully. And when I say listen, I mean, ideally, you need to be watching as well, not just listening with your ears, but also listening with your eyes and listening with all of your senses, because
Listening to whole body experience.
beautifully put, absolutely that, exactly that. Yes, there's so much that is not said, the story beneath the story, and feeling comfortable to ask the right questions often comes from actually getting permission to do so up front as well. So I think if you can set the scene for the conversation very comfortably, then you can be reasonably transparent. And then as you both get more comfortable with each other, you can be more and more transparent, more open. I guess it's about being as transparent as you possibly can under the circumstances. Never lie, never ever lie. It's never okay to lie. But at the same time, you don't want to give them all the stuff to start with, because I think if you just give them everything, you overshare, then that can be as off-putting as anything else. It's like if you, I mean, you and I have both been married to our respective wives for a very long time, and we're both very lucky and very happy. But back in the ancient mist of time when we were possibly dating, we might have gone into a bar, and in our very nervous early days, we might have walked up to a young lady who we found attractive, and might possibly, this is just hypothetical, of course, but might possibly have just started talking, especially those of us that are very verbose anyway by nature. Don't know if you've noticed. And then you just basically just start spewing up all your stuff and telling them all about you and all the things you've done and all this kind of thing. Firstly, it's desperately self-pleasuring. And secondly, even if the stuff that you're saying might actually be interesting to them at some stage, it's very off-putting because they just get overwhelmed.
Well, sales is seduction, and seduction is about finding out about them, what they care about, what matters to them, where their motivation is. And I think far too often we spend time trying to demonstrate our credibility instead of caring what the other person wants and needs. And the challenge with that is that we don't listen, we don't pay attention. And I think my friend Ron Voperice, who sadly passed away last year, used to describe attention as a currency. You pay attention. And almost nobody really pays attention, especially like the professional that you talked about, when she turned up with her deck trying to convince and trying to transact, as opposed to going to discover. And when I look at SaaS salespeople, the rush towards the demonstration, instead of seeing the demo as a discovery process and an opportunity to learn as to what the push is that's causing somebody to consider change now, what the better future is that's pulling them towards an alternative,
Yeah.
the gravity of inertia to do nothing, and the anxiety of change. And the other part of that is understanding who's in the second and third room. If you're selling to businesses, it's rare that you're selling just to your champion. Between the first room and the second room, there's the corridor where doubt starts to set in. And if they can't explain what it is, what the justifiable reason is for making the change, when they enter that second room, it's already dead. They get into the second room, and one pushback from the CFO is enough to kill it. And then when it gets to the allocation or decision committee, the buying committee, it's dead. You know, it's been thrown under the bus, and all 16 wheels have driven over it. So let's spend a bit of time looking at perceived value. In the book, you say your perceived value exists somewhere on a continuum, with worthless at one end and priceless at the other. Can you explain how positioning, confidence, and clarity shift perception?
Yes. At least I could give it a good go.
Thank you, if you would.
I'll do my very best. So yeah, I mean, your positioning is absolutely vital. The way that you talk about what you do, but more importantly, the way that you ask questions of the prospective client. And I'll call them a prospective client at this stage, because until they actually start putting money in your bank account, they're not actually a client just yet. There's a nasty habit of calling people clients before they actually start doing
They're
business with you.
future customers or not.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Until money has changed hands, nobody's anybody's client just yet. I think that positioning is vitally important, because you need to understand that you exist as a small part of a much larger ecosystem. To use the SaaS example that you just talked about there, nobody ever woke up in the morning saying, you know what I really want to do today? I really, really, really want to buy a CRM. Nobody's ever done that. I mean, unless they're a complete lunatic, of course.
Nor will they ever.
Absolutely. And on that day that, Satan will be ice skating to work on the day that happens. But and fundamentally, if you are hawking your bit of software around, and no matter how shiny and wonderful it is, no matter how many techies have made all the bells and whistles be as belly or as whistly as they possibly can be, it doesn't really matter. The positioning has got to be something that matters to the client or the prospective client. And that means you've got to be talking about the kinds of problems that they've got, so the push, to your point, and also the kinds of goals they've got, the things they want to achieve, which is the pull. And if you don't understand both that push and that pull, then you don't understand how to position what it is you're doing, because you exist as a possible solution or part of a possible solution to a wider set of business problems and goals. And unless you understand where you exist in that ecosystem from the client's perspective, you cannot position yourself appropriately, and you can't have the right conversations. So that positioning and that clarity around that positioning is absolutely fundamental. So it is a commercial duty and a moral duty to show up, ask the right questions, listen very carefully to the answers, and actually then ask follow-up questions to clarify your own understanding, to make damn sure that you haven't made some idiot mistake and made an assumption.
What you've described effectively is the contagion effect of self-doubt and lack of preparation.
Yeah.
So perception isn't a marketing trick, you say. It's a trust equation. What cues ensure that buyers feel safe paying more?
Well, to some extent, depends on the circumstances. But if you're going to talk at a very high level, the first thing is trust. You talked about trust equation. We know the David Mason trust equation: trust equals credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-orientation. So the more selfish you are, the less of that unconditional positive regard that I referred to earlier on, the less of that you have, the more likely they are to pick up on the fact that you are selfishly self-interested and that you're in it for you, not in it for them. So that's a prerequisite for them to actually pay the right value. And the right value usually is more than they thought they were going to be paying, if you are genuinely delivering actual value. So understanding where you exist on that spectrum, understanding where you exist in terms of the costs to them if they don't have you, but more importantly, the opportunity cost put in terms of the things they're trying to achieve. Because we're all trying to grow our businesses, or we're at least trying to gain some kind of market share. Maybe we're trying to have some personal development. Maybe we're trying to do all of those things. Usually we are trying to do all of those things because, again, we're all human beings. And if you can show up in a way that helps them to do the things they personally want to do, to get away from the things they personally want to get away from, because there is often a discomfort sitting where you currently sit, but it's a better the devil you know discomfort in this, unless you really position this properly. The most pernicious problem that you have is that you're generally fighting against the status quo, because people will sit in discomfort for a lot longer than they ought to, simply because they don't trust the alternative.
Well, two things that I'd like to build on there. The first thing is, if your self-interest is zero and you divide something by zero, then there is no trust either. So you need to be sufficiently self-interested, but you subjugate that and you put that second.
Yes.
And the second part that I'd like to build on, Charlie Green, who worked with David Meister on developing the trust equation, is very clear about this. He said that when they were doing the research, the most important operator on the right-hand side of the equation is intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not credibility, which is where your professional was trying to show up with the logos and everything else.
Yep.
It's not even reliability. It's how close the connection is psychologically between one human being and another. And that requires vulnerability. And
Yes.
Daryl Stickle came up with another brilliant equation, which is vulnerability times uncertainty equals perceived risk. And I've spent the last 5 years working out how to do the mathematics of trust so that you can actually quantify and put a pound or dollar amount to how much trust exists, how it flows through an organization or a relationship. And where this really tends to manifest itself very often is where we give unasked for discounts. So what's happening emotionally when someone discounts before or without even being asked for a discount?
I mean, there's a couple of things I'd just like to quickly loop back around on what you just said there, because that was really, really interesting. And I definitely want to hear more about the work you've been doing on trust, because that is deeply fascinating. I'd love to understand the mathematics of trust. That sounds great. Very much in the wheelhouse of what I need to know more about. But the thing you mentioned there about self-interest, zero, the multiplication you did there, you're absolutely right. This is why the unconditional positive regard and congruence both are required. You have to be authentic to yourself as well. So you can't just be sitting there passively being a doormat. You also have to have some self-interest, but it's not selfish. So I think that's the critical build on that. So I completely agree with you. In terms of the next part of what you asked, which has just popped straight out of my head, help me.
So what's happening emotionally when someone discounts
Thank you. Sorry, given that I'm supposed to do active listening for a living, I should probably have remembered that, really, shouldn't I?
So when the quality of my previous response.
That's what it was. I was so taken with that I forgot to listen to the next bit.
Giving myself a stroke.
If it's justified, and at least it's self-pleasuring, at least it's sex with somebody you love, right? That was a Woody Allen joke, wasn't it? Sorry, that's a very inappropriate joke. I do apologize. I'm possibly going to have to bleep that one out. So what happens when somebody leads with their chin is very often they're talking to themselves in their own heads before they ever get into the conversation with the other person. So it's the intrapersonal conversation before they have the interpersonal conversation. So they've probably they've won or lost the match before they ever actually get onto the pitch, basically. And the reality is that a lot of the childhood scripts and the things that we talk to ourselves about money are wrapped up in so many emotional things from our own childhood. And an exercise I quite often do with coaching clients is I ask them to think back to the very first memory they've got where they understood that money was a thing, and they could actually, the first time they saw money, or they understood that money was something. And they can usually come up with a story, because very often money is tied up with so many emotional things from your childhood. And for a lot of us, and I'm going to include myself in this, money was the source of, if not marital strife between your parents, at least if there was ever tension, money was often at the root of it.
Saturday morning when Dad was balancing the checkbooks.
There you go.
Always ended up in a row.
What a perfect example. A perfect example. Mine's really similar. I can distinctly remember my dad being quizzed by my mum, "Did you put petrol in the car?" And he had this look of guilt on his face, like an instant. I mean, as a child, you sort of read body language. You just can't put names to it. But I know it was guilt. It was this sort of shifty look. And I just put a bluey in the car. And I thought, what's that? And back in the 70s, a bluey was like a £5 note.
Yeah.
So because of the color of the note. And so I had to ask what that even meant. And so, but I remember the awkwardness, the subtext of awkwardness between the two of them. And these two people who loved each other very much, and there was never really any major strife. So it was something that stood out. So yeah, exactly that. It's that Saturday morning checkbook balancing. But those childhood scripts, the things of it's rude to talk about money, it's awkward, it's something maybe a little bit shamefaced, it's the sort of thing that you have to feel guilty about. Did I spend that money? Should I have spent that money? All those things from your childhood, they do a number on your head. And unfortunately, we carry that baggage with us into any kind of interaction where money is likely to be a topic of conversation. And so you end up, in the case of most of these professionals who are very smart, very bright people, leading with their chin, because the stories they're telling themselves are that, well, that's a lot of money. Oh, that's a lot of money. Or, yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to pay that much money. I probably shouldn't say, oh, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll tell them what my hourly rate is, but then I'll tell them I'll do it. I'll do a deal. I'll do a deal. And they've had that conversation in their head before they even get into the conversation. And they don't know what value is yet. They don't know whether it's a lot of money, because value's in the eye of the beholder. They know it's the other person who will determine whether it's a lot or not, because it's only defined as being a lot if it's a lot on their terms. So yeah, it happens a heck of a lot, and just being able to have those internal conversations in a much more healthy way, where you're able to start to recognize where those scripts have come from and what those scripts are telling you, and recognize them for what they are, which is a hangover from the past, and being able to articulate what a much healthier future version of yourself might actually say if he or she was able to speak to you, and listen to that voice instead.
So that brings me to the next question. So this might be a little bit personal, but what belief did you have to unlearn in order to be able to write this book?
That's a very, very good question. And it is personal. And that's why I like it. Because ultimately, if you can't be genuine, you can't be real, and you can't be vulnerable in these things, then I have no business writing a book like this one. Certainly have no business trying to coach other people on it. So the work I've done on myself with this stuff includes money concept like the one I've just talked about, that's rooted in the stuff that I just talked about. When I was growing up, we had very little income. Everything was very much about hand to mouth. There was a lot of, because I had in some measure a bit of an idyllic childhood. I was brought up on a nature reserve, so there was a lot of barter economy stuff. I used to have to pick a lot of lead shot out of the food that I had. So you know, it was in many ways a bit of a swallows and Amazons kind of quite an idyllic way of living. But in another way, if you want a boot camp in how to screw up your money concept, that's me. I had every problem. You know, it's rude to talk about money. You're not worth that kind of amount. You should never talk about it. You should never spend it. You should save. You shouldn't spend. All of these kinds of things that I was told. It doesn't grow on trees. It's the root of all evil. And then I got older, and I came across people who had different scripts. And I can still remember my first business partner. He had a totally brilliant money concept. His phrase, his one from his childhood was, "There's no pockets in shrouds. There's no banks. There's no banks in heaven. There's no pockets in shrouds." You know,
I should be lifting that.
I love it. I mean, that was a radical moment of reframing for me, and I wouldn't have known that that's what it was at the time, because I had yet to get my first business coach. But when I did get my first coach about 20 odd years ago, that's when the work really started in earnest. But yeah, that was a really powerful moment of realization of, oh look, not everybody sees this in the same way that I do. That's quite helpful.
So, how do you define the difference between self-worth and market worth?
That's a really interesting concept. Self-worth is tied up with, well, firstly, a sense of self-awareness. You can't have self-worth without self-awareness. So that takes you back to that balance between your external and internal loci of evaluation, and having a strong foundation point. So that was might have been a little bit of an esoteric conversation for some listeners, and I hope it wasn't, because that's probably one of the most important lessons ever to learn. There's some great work, by the way, by a lady called Tasha Eurich and her team around self-awareness. That's really worth listening to, reading up on. There's an HBR article about it as well. So firstly, you've got to get that self-awareness. Then you've got the self-worth is recognizing that you have a walk-away price, a walk-away presence, a level below which you will not go, because the least you'll accept is the most you will ever get. And that's one of the principal lessons in the book. And I think I repeat it at least 4, if not 5 times throughout the book. And then just for good measure, I put it on the last page as well in the 10 biggest takeaways from the book, because I really think that's one of the most important ones. So that is really self-worth, is knowing what you are delivering actually has an intrinsic value. And if the other person isn't prepared to pay that price, either you've done a poor job of helping them to see the value, or you're actually just not their person. You're not their solution. And that's okay. That's fine, because you're not going to be for everybody. That's all right.
Or you don't believe the value that you're trying to convey.
Yes, I think that's true. If you haven't got a true sense of that self-worth, where you actually have an absolute fundamental knowledge. I mean, go beyond belief. It's a knowledge that you know that you're worth that. It's an absolute intrinsic. It's an article of faith that you are worth that, and it has to be baked in, because your point earlier on, the world will reflect what you project.
Well, I think what you pointed out there really is that many people discount, I'd say not out of guilt, but out of shame rather than strategy. And they hide behind humility because it feels safer than being overtly visible. So
Yes.
is underpricing a confidence gap or a covert way to stay in control and feel safe and comfortable? So you're using it as a shield rather than trying to advance the sale and solve the customer's problem, or put yourself in a position where they can buy from you.
I think that feels like it might be a false dichotomy, because I think it could be both. I think it could be a confidence gap and also a shield and a way of staying comfortable and in your comfort zone. So, in fact, you could say the confidence gap is precisely the thing that's keeping you in your comfort zone to some degree. So it feels like they're probably related. The comfort zone is definitely the big part of it, though. It's that if I stay here, I'm safe, and I will stay in my lane. I'll stay at my level. I'll only charge this much because I know I can get away with it. And that's a very telling phrase, get away with it. And I've heard that so often from really smart, very, very, very highly educated, very capable, competent people who really do have a positive impact on the lives of their clients. And their clients are often delighted to pay more. I had a situation with one of my coaching clients a couple of months ago, a brand new coaching client to me. And they said quite proudly that their clients were telling them to charge more. They were literally telling them to charge more. You might be missing something here. Can you see? Can you see? You might be missing something. There's a bit of a gap. You are definitely undercharging, and I'm not saying that you have to be, resorting to what we used to call in my retail days insult pricing, or top end of dizzy insult pricing was one phrase that we used to use, where basically it really is about ripping somebody off. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about pricing for actual value. And so, the market value, to loop back around and answer the second half of your earlier question, just proves that I do listen, was actually that is defined to some extent by obviously the market's price, in the sense that there are certain established pricing structures that are out there. But you can change that even through price positioning. And I mean, the classic example, I referred earlier on to my undifferentiated bland coffee earlier on, but the classic example is Starbucks. When you and I first started, going to Greasy Spoons or Calf's or whatever they were, because there were no coffee shops as such back in the day, you pay what, 20p for a coffee? Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of brown grit in some hot water, isn't it? It's not terribly exciting. I mean, these days you can get all these different bits and pieces that might possibly give it some additional intrinsic value, but fundamentally, yeah, right, maybe, yeah, you might get to 25p. But then you get to this market positioning thing where you can change the perceived value of something simply by positioning it differently. Because along comes this place, this brand from Pike Place Market in Seattle, and says that no, we don't sell coffee. What we do is we sell a lifestyle experience where you can come into our lovely-ish environments, and you've got free Wi-Fi, and you've got a place that you can plug your MacBook Pro in, and you can sit there sipping on your caramel macchiato latte, double espresso, whatever. Keep on layering enough descriptions onto it, and maybe you won't notice the fact you're paying £6.50 for what you probably would have paid 25p for 20 years ago. So.
Okay, so how do we overcome the challenge of letting the market judge our value and make sure that we show up confident in our pricing and comfortable having that conversation? Because theory is easy in the moment,
yes.
But what happens when someone actually asks you for the number?
Yeah, that is the trick, isn't it? Actually, that's not fair. It's not a trick at all. It's practice. It's practice and it's mindset. So understanding that this is about a little bit like when you learn how to drive. You get good at driving when you actually learn, or at least competent at driving, when you learn to look down the road and anticipate what's coming, anticipate the oncoming traffic. and make sure that you are steering your car in such a way that you're not likely to drive straight into it. That definitely helps with the driving experience. So it is with any of these intimate conversations that you are now entering into, because to the point you made before about trust, intimacy is the critical part of that equation. And it does take vulnerability. It does take showing up with a level of disarming honesty about who you really are, what you can really do, and what you also can't do. And if you set up your conversation in such a way that you are being very clear up front at the beginning of the conversation about the nature of what you're going to talk about, you could say, look, if we at some stage during the course of this 45 minutes together or an hour together or whatever it is, if we get the sense that maybe we could be doing some kind of business together, we're going to need to talk about the investment that might be necessary. When we get to that conversation, don't let me forget to talk about the money, because it can be something that I struggle to talk about because it's not something I particularly like talking about. I'm guessing you're the same, because most of us are. And just by being really open about that, it goes back to the vulnerability place. If you can be really straightforward with them, then very, very often you know that when you get to it, it's a human conversation rather than a desperate conversation. And instead of snatching the wheel to steer out of the oncoming traffic, you're steering around things very smoothly, and it's a much, much better experience. You also then, when you get to the point when you're talking about it, if they start saying, well, I want to know about how much it's going to be, if it's too early in the conversation for you to say that because you don't yet know what the value is, you can then refer back to that earlier point and say, well, do you remember at the beginning of the conversation when I said that we would talk about money? We definitely will do that. But until I understand fully what this means to you, I can't really price this. I don't want to base our relationship, should we have one, on guesswork. I'd rather base it on facts, because I think that's a better trusted advisor relationship. And that's how I do my best work on my client's behalf. So that kind of a conversation is it means that you're not leading with your chin, and you're giving yourself the breathing space to be able to steer properly.
To take the metaphor slightly further, I think you also need to be very aware of what's going on in your mirrors and what's going on ahead of you in terms of the people in the same lane, because it's very easy to back end the car in front if you're not paying attention to how they're driving and how erratic they are. But you also need to be looking at people who might be overtaking you. And so I think this comes back down to a practical anchor, which is that I think in the book you say something along the lines of money's the language of business. And if you wanted to get fluent in any other language, you practice it in private before you try to speak it in public.
Yes.
So can you describe what private rehearsal, scripting, calibration, and desensitization before fee talks might look like, so that we can get a sense of how you prep and how you prep your clients?
That's absolutely right. So yes, the professionals practice in private piece is something that I firmly believe is true. And it's like anything else. The more practice you have, the better you get at it. And you use the word desensitization. Given the emotional resonance that money has for most of us, desensitization is necessary. I'll give you a great example of one of my coaching clients who I've been working with for probably about 18 months or so now, which is quite a long time for a one-on-one coaching relationship. But again, she's another commercial real estate lawyer. I have quite a lot of commercial real estate lawyers that I work with. And when she first started talking to me, again, she had these kinds of childhood scripts, exactly the stuff that we've been talking about. And the big thing was that she wasn't used to talking about big numbers. So in order to get really comfortable with this stuff, we both started to normalize it across every part of our conversation. It wasn't just like one kind of boot camp or rehearsal or role play, although we did plenty of those as well. It was everything that we did, everything we talked about. So we started every conversation where we would go through her latest billing spreadsheets, and we would talk about all of the numbers. And so we'd look at the cumulative totals first. So you'd look at the biggest numbers first. And we'd get really comfortable just talking about those as numbers on a piece of paper, so that it just normalized the idea of the ebb and flow of money. And we started talking about liquidity and cash flow and, all these very exciting things that without which businesses tend to go bump. And it normalized it to such a degree that when we then started talking about the client conversations and anticipating those and doing our preparation and understanding what kind of questions we wanted to ask and all those kinds of things when she was going into the conversation with the prospective client, the money stuff just started to flow an awful lot more easily, because it was just part of this wider way of viewing the world. Because you can't just change one aspect of the way you think, you have to change the whole thing. And so then we also got journaling going. So not everybody takes to journaling like a duck to water. So you kind of need to maybe try a few different journaling techniques before you find the one that clicks, if you ever do. Fortunately for me, with her, we found a technique that actually clicked for her. Nice and simple, 5 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening. So it was a very simple setup in the morning to see how she was going to show up today. There was an affirmation statement in there as well. Affirmation statements, and sorry if this sounds terribly pretentious, but this stuff works. It goes back to the point about identity. So an affirmation statement that works tends to be identity based. So it tends to start with the first person pronoun I or me. and it tends to be the verb to be, I am. So I am this. So, and no conditionality in there. So there's no fluff. There's not I am this when I am such and such. No, it's I am this, and it's a statement. It might be aspirational, but it's a statement of who you are. So I am confident when I talk to my clients. I am worth the money I charge. Frankly, I love the L'Oreal one. I am worth it. It just, it just works. I remember affirmation statements are entirely private to you. So if this sounds really hubristic and you think, God, I could never say that, the old Stella Artois thing, reassuringly expensive. I am reassuringly expensive. I quite like the wit in that. I quite like the humor in it because it's got a certain something about it. But
I use a slightly different spin on this, which is formations, where I turn it into a question. So for me to show up and be worth it in the eyes of the client, what do I need to project? And then I go through that rehearsal, and it allows me to achieve a state of congruence without feeling like it's hubristic or a fake.
I love that. That's a really good build. That's my learn. I'm stealing that. Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Yes. That's really neat. Yeah. So turn it into a question. And that goes back to the point of, there's only really sort of two ways to get inside anybody's head, including your own. And one is to tell stories, and the other one is to ask questions. And the great benefit of asking questions is you make the other person or yourself think.
And again, I'm just going to pick up on the verb, the make bit. I think what we need to do is we've got to empower, we've got to equip, we've got to enable. And our job in sales is to act as a leader. Leaders empower other people to make good decisions well, even under pressure, even where they're facing two bad choices, and for them to be able to live with the consequences of those decisions. We make the mistake of thinking that selling is about persuasion. Selling is about clearing the path. I love this concept of reverse graffiti. Reverse graffiti marketers essentially take a high pressure washer and a stencil and clean the path so that what's left is the key message. And so that's what I adopt in our marketing. It's how I try and approach content, but it's also how I try and approach the sale, because my job isn't to put the evidence in front of them. It's to create the conditions where they build the evidence and build the case for themselves. And that's why we run practice labs. We run practice labs 4 times a month so that people can practice in a safe environment without having to practice in front of the customer. I think building on what you said, we need to think about the language we use. A cost is so often framed as a loss.
Yes.
And you're going to spend money, whereas an investment is framed as a gain, and where the buyer's brain is perceiving the future value. So that's the pull and the better future. So can we just spend a minute or two on how language reframing changes the client's and the seller's psychology?
Yes, I think that's a really good. Thank you for the catch on the misuse of the word "make" as well, because you're right, that's the wrong verb. It is more about empowerment and enablement. Spot on. Well, thank you for holding me accountable on that one. The reframing the language is critical. Language is very important. I think you use the example in the book, even within my own teams. So the team that I run at the moment, we don't close deals, we open accounts. So a closing is an ending. A closing feels like that's the termination of something. The opening is the beginning of something. And that's really the beginning of everything that we've actually worked for in order to help to ally with this, to use this phrase, with this potential buyer, to help them to become your new customer or your new client. Or indeed in the case of the stuff that I'm doing, to become a candidate who will ultimately join us within our fee share law firm. Because all of these things are a trusted advisor relationship. So I think even the language you use within your own team is fundamental when it comes to these things. So investment rather than cost, absolutely, completely agree with that. Cost speaks to a scarcity mindset. It tends to mean that you tend to batten down your hatches. It means that you tend to start playing not to lose rather than playing to win, which is not what you want to do. I think the point you made earlier on about paying attention and using that as a currency, or the analogy being a currency, I think you also spend time. So the same is true of time. And the interesting thing is that unlike money, time is not fungible. And yet we are much happier to spend time than we are to invest it. So it's fundamental that whenever we get into any conversation with anybody, we recognize the truth of the old statement, which is that you cannot respect somebody and disrespect their time. And it's vitally important that you invest time with somebody and they are investing time with you and you help them to make a return on that investment. So they always get something out of the conversation with you, and you always get something out of the conversation with them as well. So I think every piece of language here is fundamentally important. But coming back to that value piece, it's a hackneyed old coaching model, grow model, and we've all come across it. What are your goals? What's the reality? What are the options? And what will you do? That's the standard. And there's a bunch of questions that you can ask, which will help to tease all of those things out. But I do find that actually that model works incredibly well, and it's really easy to use when you are having an open conversation with somebody that you are potentially going to form a business relationship with. What are your goals? What do you actually want? What do you want to achieve? What are your big desires? Where's the business going? Where are you going? These are great conversational starters because actually it's interesting. It's genuinely fascinating. I've yet to meet somebody who's truly boring, who is running a business or is, that's not strictly true, there are a couple, but then certainly not entirely stultifying. They've always got something interesting in there if you're digging enough. Everybody's got something to tell you. There's always a story. And then you go back to, okay, so where are you today? What's the reality? And then that helps you identify the gap between those two things. And if you, in any measure, can help to fill that gap, well, that then speaks to the third thing, which is the options. What are the options that we've got here? How could we potentially work together? Should we work together? Is there enough of a fit? And then it's about the will. It's about where you go next. So I think having those really open, sensible, balanced conversations that help people to make the right decision, it's just choice architecture at the end of the day through a good conversation.
Fabulous. And this really brings me to how, when we speak to a buyer and price first comes up, something goes on in the buyer's brain. How can professionals use that choice architecture to pivot from anxiety to curiosity in that moment so that the buyer is leaning in instead of pulling back? And what separates confident from performative in those moments?
Oh, gosh, that's a three-part question.
I know I shouldn't ever do those, but you're a big boy.
Well, I'll do my best. You watch, I'll forget the third part again now. Okay, so the first part, how can you get them to lean in? How can you get them to what's going on in their brain? And then how can you get them to lean in? Or help
trigger,
them
lean
to
in, performative.
Yeah, help them to lean in is the key part, not make them. Going back to the verb again. So what's going on in their brain very often is fight or flight. It's fight, flight, freeze, fawn, any of those other various bits and pieces going on. My old psychology lecturer used to call it the back in the day they used to call it the 4F response, which is fight, flight, freeze, or populate. Which my psychology lecturer had a naughty streak of humor as well. And ultimately, you've got we all know it, the amygdala fires. You get the rush of adrenaline and all these other bits and pieces that shut down your higher brain functions, and basically you go into self-preservation mode. And self-preservation is entirely instinctive, and effectively they see you as a big saber-toothed tiger with teeth and claws and everything else, and you're no longer their ally. So if you haven't shown up in the right way, and if you haven't set the scene for you being able to have that money conversation in a way that maintains that equal stature, then it's very, very easy to watch them kind of go into that mode. So getting to lean in is a function of you having a very sensible conversation up front so that they know what to expect. Psychological safety comes from a couple of things. It comes from certainty, so I know what to expect, and it comes from agency, so they have a level of control. And this is again one of these things that I do with my coaching clients all the time. I talk about the first word that you learn probably when you're about 8, 9, 10 months old, which actually allows you to genuinely exert control over the, and you just mouthed it. There you go, no. And the minute you learn it as a 8, 9 month old, you start to use it on everything, even the stuff you want, because it allows you to influence and control the world. No, I don't want to eat that thing. It was my favorite food yesterday. No, I don't need the toilet. Oh, yes, I do. All those things that you do as a 9 or 10 month old, which when you're first starting to see yourself as a separate entity, and an autonomous entity. So the very, very least, the baseline, the ticket to the game, your table stakes for giving the other person a sense of autonomy and agency is to give them the explicit permission to say the word no.
What does that first 60 seconds of a good money conversation sound like in that case? Tone, framing, silence, permission, anchoring?
Tone is very much warm. It's pleasant. It's to some extent very human. It's just being congruent with who you really are. It's authentic in the sense that there's no desperation coming through here. You're here with a total curiosity. And the curiosity you've got is, I'm interested to find out more about you. And I'm also interested to find out if there's a potential business relationship. That's not the whole of everything, because the worst case scenario that here is that we walk away from having an interesting conversation. So that's the tone, that's the mindset that you have. And you set it up at the beginning saying, look, experience tells me that not all of these conversations end up in a business relationship. Maybe not straight away, maybe not at all. So it could well be that during the course of this conversation, you think, well, this chap hasn't got anything for me. That's okay. That's fine. I'm still interested to meet you. I'm still interested to have a coffee with you. It might be that during the course of the conversation, the things you tell me that actually I'm not the right person to help you anyway. Although if I know anybody who can, I'll certainly recommend them. But if there is a potential business relationship, then I'm sure that two people of our experience can probably work that out. And we can certainly have a conversation about it. Does that sound reasonable? And it's just a very nice, very open first 60 seconds where you set the stall out with total authenticity that actually it could be a no for them. It could be a no for you. It could be a yes, or it might be a, we'll speak again some point in the future, but for a good reason.
So I think we're agreed that pricing is less about persuasion and more about preparation and identity. Yes. So looking back at the younger Matthew, what did you used to believe about money that now makes you wince?
I think what I used to believe that definitely makes me wince now is that it's entirely finite, that there's only so much money to go around, that I would only ever have so much. And this is going back again to the, oh no, we can't afford that, or you can look but you can't touch, you can't afford that, that kind of, those kinds of scripts from childhood. And that stuff held me back for a very, very long time. It stopped me from asking for the kind of money that I ought to have been paid. It stopped me, it made me very surprised when I did get salary increases out of the blue. For as far as I could tell, wow, that's amazing. I'm getting a promotion to £15,000 a year instead of whatever it was I was earning before, 12, I think it was at that point. That was a huge increase at that time. So all of those things, those kinds of initial belief scripts, if you will, that if I look back now, I think, how the heck did I ever get anywhere thinking like that? And honestly, it's because actually other people did have my best interests at heart and other people had my back. And so I owe an awful lot to other people in those early days. People lifted me up, sometimes knowing they were doing it and other times without knowing they were doing it. Like the guy I told you became my first business partner who had the phrase, no pockets and shrouds, that he lifted me up without even realizing he was doing it with that one.
What changes when we treat pricing as design, not defense then?
Explain.
Well, I fundamentally believe that most problems with sales occur because of a problem with systemic design dysfunction. And more often than not, that then manifests with people projecting out that they're not comfortable. So they're projecting that they're defensive. And sometimes the best form of defense to the primitive brain is attack. And so I'm curious, if we spend time designing and structuring those conversations, put the effort into thinking as the customer instead of about what we can do to or take from the customer, then we can eliminate an awful lot of that resistance in ourselves, which means that we're not projecting it.
Got you. Absolutely. No, I think you have, and I think you probably answered it far better than I could have done. But no, you're absolutely right. There is freedom in process. And if you've got a process that is liberating and gives you a set of handrails which can guide you rather than handcuffs which bind you, then you absolutely have a way of working which makes you agile in the moment and makes you able to show up and be present in a way that you couldn't do if you were just frankly winging it. And the problem is that an awful lot of people go into these things thinking that they are quote unquote natural salespeople, or worse, unnatural salespeople, or that they just have this way that they were taught to do it. And it usually has something akin to winging it underpinning the whole thing, because they don't really have a well-defined process, which means they probably do some of the right stuff some of the time, but they don't do all of the right stuff all of the time, which means they get at best inconsistent results, and at worst, completely unsatisfactory results, or worse, consistently unsatisfactory results. But if you want to be consistent, you want to have clarity, and you want to feel really present, then you need to know where you are in the script. It's a bit like when you learn how to play a piece of music. I mean, I'm a musician, so this is an analogy that works great for me, probably less so for other people. But when you're first learning how to play any tune, you learn the order that the notes go in, and you start to play them, and you play the right notes, and you get something that is broadly recognizable. But the more you do it, and the more you actually recognize the process, and you recognize where the bars are, where the beats are, this is the bit where the chorus comes in, this is the bit where you hit the middle eight, this is the bit where there's the instrumental break in the middle. So you know all the bits and the sections and where it's all supposed to go, and you know how it's supposed to sound. The more you practice it, the more you build up that muscle memory, the more you actually start to hear and feel the music rather than actually play the notes. And that's the sort of thing you're looking for, because there is a structure. There is a system that you know that structure in your head, and you know how it's supposed to sound and how it's supposed to feel. So once you know that, and you know it at a visceral level, when you've got it internalized, when it's muscle memory, then you stop playing the tune and start actually playing the music, if that makes sense.
It does. And I mean, through this conversation, we've moved from fear to fluency. So let's close on what this all means for meaning and for legacy. So you've given people a bunch of tools in the book and on this conversation. What's the change you hope they'll feel, not just make?
Ultimately, I mean, I talked earlier on about humanistic philosophy, and you know, your humanistic psychologists and sociologists like Maslow and Carl Rogers and everything else, they were the ones who proposed this idea of self-actualization, which is moving towards a state where you are the best person you can possibly be, that you are truly fulfilled, but on your own terms. And the belief is, and I firmly hold this belief, that all of us, all things being equal, have that desire to be the best version of ourselves, whatever that might mean, on our own terms, that we can possibly be. So having barriers in the way to that is obviously something that is to be addressed. And so if there is any legacy at all from these kinds of conversations, from the book, from the kinds of work that you do, I hope that it is removing barriers so that great people can feel really good about what they're doing and know that they are truly adding value to the clients that they work with, and indeed the other people within their own lives. Because this doesn't just affect your business work and your client work, it also affects how you show up and how you feel in your own life generally. Getting comfortable with who you really are. I mean, I think it's what Brené Brown quite often refers to as one of the great gifts of middle age. You start to get to the point where you're more comfortable in your own skin, and you can play the movie to its end in your head before you actually get there. So you kind of anticipate stuff. All of those kinds of things, I think, could be a really valuable legacy. So if you could in any way, or if I could, or if you can, or any of us can help somebody else in any way to just remove a single barrier, then frankly, I think we've done a pretty good job for the day.
What did the book teach you about your own blind spots?
Oh, that's a great question. Who was it who said that in order to know what I think, I need to write it? Can remember. Ironically, I can't remember who wrote that. It's interesting. I mean, the first thing is it taught me that I've got a bigger blind spot than I thought I had over my own process at times. And sometimes, you know, I should do what I teach. There's a wonderful phrase from Shane Parris, which is, "Don't tell me your priorities, show me your calendar," which I think is great. It's really brutal, but brutally pragmatic. You know, ultimately, if you look at your calendar and the stuff you say your priorities aren't on your calendar, they're not priorities, not really. So I looked at when I first started writing this book, and this is about the process of writing itself. I was saying, "Oh, I'm writing this book, I'm writing this book, I'm writing this book," and then I realized I wasn't actually getting anywhere. And then I looked at my calendar and realized that I didn't actually have anywhere in the calendar for writing the book. So there was that binder point. So there's definitely a process issue there, but that's true for everything that you do. And so it caused me to not only recalibrate and re-time block my calendar, which I do periodically anyway, to make sure that all of the right priorities were in there. But actually, it caused me to then go back and look at certain other things in my own process as well. And am I always doing the things that I say I'm going to do? So when I am showing up for an initial discovery meeting with a potential candidate, for example, or I'm showing up for a meeting with a potential coaching client or whatever, am I always doing the things I say I'm going to do? Or am I in any way leading with my chin? Is any measure of my old money concept creeping back in? And you know, occasionally, kind of does. You know, this is a bit like when you're growing a garden. Weeds creep in if you don't actually keep weeding the damn thing. You know, and things don't always grow the way you want them to grow unless you actually prune and train and make sure that things keep going. So it's an iterative process. This never ends. And so that caused me to actually go back to school, which is great. So I'm doing another master's degree at the moment because, frankly, having a coaching supervisor is something that holds me accountable. It's great. Got myself another accountability partner. So being a product of the product, to use a phrase that you and I probably used to use in a different environment, remains a very, very healthy thing to do.
So you help others value themselves. Where do you still undervalue yourself?
I have to think about that one. Where do I still undervalue myself? I don't know. That might be a blind spot still. Don't know. It's the honest answer to that.
Okay.
That's a very, very genuine answer. I'm not going to flannel you.
No,
I
no,
don't
no.
know.
So which line in the book do you read back to yourself to help you identify your blind spots?
Probably the one that I repeated multiple times. The least you'll accept is the most you'll get. That's probably why I repeated it so often.
Okay. So if someone finishes this episode and is still afraid to change properly, what one act of self-respect would you want them to take today or tomorrow?
I think the first thing is to, well, I mean, this sounds terribly self-serving, but it's not aimed at you necessarily needing to work with either someone like me or someone like Marcus, but get yourself a coach, get somebody in your corner. This is a very, very lonely existence. Why the hell are you doing it on your own? I've been coached for the last 20 odd years, and I've had multiple coaches, and I would never be without that relationship. I genuinely believe it's one of the most profound things that you can do. Spend some time in deep reflection about who you really are. And that might sound self-indulgent. It's not. It's the opposite of self-indulgent. It's actually about helping you to get some real self-awareness. Think deeply about your core values. What makes you angry? What pisses you off? Forgive my phraseology. What is the one behavior or two behaviors or three behaviors that really, really make you angry? Because that's a clue to your core values. Who are the people that you truly admire in your life? What is it you value about them and you admire about them? Because that's a clue to your values as well. What are those things that you really, really value? And to what extent do you adhere to those things and do you live to those values? What extent do you aspire to them? How close are you to achieving your best self in that regard? Spend some time in that kind of self-reflection, because once you have that baseline, that internal locus of evaluation, it becomes a heck of a lot easier to be resilient, to learn from failure, to actually allow the affirmations to land. So all those I am statements and the brilliant questions that Marcus talked about earlier on that you can ask yourself to help you to build that mental robustness. That's much, much easier once you actually have that baseline of that internal locus of evaluation, which is immutable and it just becomes a core part of who you are. And yeah, if we really are talking about one thing you could do, it's build your self-awareness in that regard and your self-esteem, therefore.
So wrapping up, can you finish this sentence for me? Money at its best is
a facilitator of freedom, security, and liberty.
That's pretty much the heart of it. Not money as power, but
Nope.
money as proof of trust and self-worth.
Yeah, it's a facilitator. That's all it is. It's the score at the end of the game. It's not how you play the game itself.
Matthew, thank you, first of all, for writing Show Me the Money, but also for reminding us that fairness and courage can coexist in the same sentence.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That was probably one of the most in-depth conversations I've had in quite a long time. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you, sir.
Likewise. So how can people get hold of you?
I'm always available on LinkedIn. There's only two Dashper-Hughes. The other one's my wife. And if you come across somebody called Faye, that's her. The other one's me. So Matthew with two T's.
It's not due for the weekend, then.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, no, absolutely. I mean, hey, respect my life choices. It's very easy to find me. On LinkedIn, you'll find my mobile number. You'll find my email address. I actually quite like talking to people, so I put my contact details out there. I don't hide.
Excellent. Matthew Dashper-Hughes, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So this is Marcus Cauchi signing off once again from the Inquisitor podcast. I'd like you to think about the last time you discounted, apologized for your fees, or avoided the topic entirely. What would change if you treated that moment not as a threat, but as a test of trust? And with that, thank you, and happy selling. Bye-bye.